morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Monday, March 28th, 2022. And on this episode, I've got the sixth of a series covering papers of one of the most prominent anti-federalist writers, Cato. And in this paper, he talks about apportionment, representation, and taxation, and then also the power of the Senate, which he considers to be leading towards an aristocracy. My favorite line is actually something he never really even gets into further, whether in this paper or his next one, talking about, or a warning or a prediction, that the treaty power, the combination of the power of the president and the Senate, would lead to all kinds of foreign war. Check out this quote. I'll get to it again later in the episode. By treaties, engagements may be made to raise an army, and you may be transported to Europe to fight the wars of ambitious princes. Sounds pretty familiar to what we face today. I want to get right to this. I'm going to touch on the chat a little bit later in the show, and I want to first start out with Cato number 6, which is December 13th, 1787. And the first part, when you read through this, I'll link to this in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. It's all spelled out. That's where you're going to find all the stuff that I referenced for today's episode. And actually at the bottom of that page, there's a section on the Anti-Federalist series for Brutus and now Cato that I'm wrapping up pretty soon. Now, the first part of Cato number 6 actually is not going to sound too great. It's going to sound pretty awful to our modern senses. He's got issues with apportionment of representation, taxes. He's talking about the 3/5 clause. And his complaint is that it's going to be too inclusive rather than the other way around. Basically, we could make the argument that he's saying the problem is that they're using the word persons rather than men. He doesn't complain that women aren't involved but should be. He actually says that they aren't qualified for the job of running the government or being involved and should be excluded. He actually wraps it up with this quote that I think sums it up pretty well. He says, "But what aid can the community derive from the assistance of women, infants, and slaves in their deliberation or in their defense?" I actually covered it quite more detail. The 3/5 clause, the history behind the 3/5 compromise, was an episode that I did last April in 2021. I will link to that in the show notes. I do encourage you to check it out. It's some detailed history. It goes back to the Articles of Confederation and things like that, and it explains it, I think, in pretty good detail. Anyways, moving on from there, after that first introduction by Cato, Tara Ross sums up his transition to the next phase best. She says, "You will appreciate his other points about taxation much more. The doctrine of taxation is a very important one," he begins, "and nothing requires more wisdom and prudence than its regulation. Not regulating us, but regulating their ability to tax. He believes the proposed new government will be very expensive, and its enormous expense will leave very little for the people." He actually argued that it was going to drive the people to bankruptcy. Now, a common Federalist claim at the time was that no matter how much the government was going to cost, they were going to be able to take care of it. It wasn't going to cost too much, and they had a way of dealing with it. Almost all the tax revenue, if not all of it, to fund the powers of the government was going to come from trade and import duties. And Cato says this was, well, here's how he describes it. He says, "The advocates for this new system hold out an idea that you will have but little to pay for, that the revenue will be so managed as to be almost wholly drawn from the source of trade or duties on imports." A lot of the anti-federalist arguments was like, okay, even if we need to do this, this is going to be really expensive. How are we going to pay for this? And then the argument, of course, was, well, we'll just tax imports and trades and that will actually handle it. And Cato actually says this is a crock. He says, but this is delusive. For this government to discharge all its incidental expenses. He's warning, just like some of the other anti-federalist writers, that, the whole idea of necessary and proper, even if you could argue that it was the legal doctrine of principle and incidence, was going to be very expansive. And this, I think, kind of touches on that as well, warning that they're going to have all kinds of extra costs that you may not be able to think of today. He says, for this government to discharge all its incidental expenses, besides paying the interest on the home and foreign debts, of course, there was a lot of debt from the war, will require more money than its commerce can afford. So he's saying there's no way. There's no way. All you have to do is do the math, follow the science, right? Just add it all up. And what we're going to have to deal with is going to be far more than our commerce can handle. And he actually gets into some interesting free market positions. And here's how Tara Ross puts it. Cato makes counter arguments that might sound a bit familiar. Who do you think ends up paying those taxes? So if you're taxing imports, you're taxing trade, who actually pays those taxes? Because the argument was that, oh, the taxes aren't going to hit the average person, but if people need to do trade to earn a living, to get the products that they need or that they want, then who actually pays for that? The businesses, she asks? No, consumers pay the tax. Thus, high taxes hurt commerce and drive down the government's revenue. So the more that they tax foreign trade, the more that commerce goes down, and then the revenue is going to be needed elsewhere. Jason Mandrish puts it this way. He says when things are more expensive, and then he's basically describing in a short version. There's a very long piece that Tara actually cites that you can read in full detail. Of course, I'm going to link to Cato's full paper. I'm going to link to Tara Ross's blog and Jason Mandrish over at Founder of the Day as well. And he's summing it up like this. When things are more expensive, if you raise taxes, it makes it more expensive, right? Less people buy them, leaving citizens without products they might need. To make up for the loss in sales, merchants would have to raise prices, making things even more expensive. In this situation, the merchants would see sales drop and therefore import less. If less is imported, the government will need to make up the loss in import duties by increasing taxes on the average person who is already in a situation where they cannot afford basic goods. I mean, this is supply and demand stuff, basic free market viewpoints. And Cato's actually making the case that you can't just throw a bunch of taxes on stuff. Maybe you need to reduce the size and scope of government if you really want to be able to make it fit within this power without damaging commercial activity, which harms the average person. In fact, it harms the poor people the most. All these taxes and regulations, and today we have the taxation of money printing, of inflation, which makes everything cost more. The more that they print money and hand it out as a freebie one year, then in the following year or years later or in the near future, at some point, everything costs so much more. And this harms everyday people the most. I'm going to get to Cato warning about a direct tax as a result of this. He basically predicted that because of this, because you're not going to be able to sustain this approach, and he actually called it on this, he actually called that he expected a direct tax on individuals, even though different than what ended up happening in, we'll say, 1913, which was a pretty bad year. But I first want to mention, if you're enjoying this episode, you enjoy this work that we do at the 10th Amendment Center. I didn't give my name at the beginning. My name is Michael Bolden. Of course, we broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles. And you just enjoy this show that we do on a regular basis, and you support the work that we do at the TAC. Nothing, absolutely nothing helps us roll up our sleeves every single day and reach and teach people about the Constitution and liberty and how to defend them when government refuses to, which is constantly more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can do that. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Enough for the advertisement. I want to get right back to Cato. He said this idea of funding government on duties, on imports, is absolutely absurd. It's never going to work. And we'd end up with this direct tax on individuals. He says, government will find that the press so heavily on commerce will not do, and therefore must have recourse to other objects. They're going to have to find another way to get their loot in order to be a much larger government than what they were doing. He says there will be a capitation or poll tax, a tax on each individual. He says, but will you submit to be numbered like the slaves of an arbitrary despot? I could go a long way with that. He's expecting that each person is going to be numbered at some point. And what will be your reflections when the tax master thunders at your door for the duty on that light, which is the bounty of heaven? Pretty prophetic there. And in fact, he even claims that this is a prediction of sorts. He says, the burdens on you will be insupportable. And the only way they can continue growing the size of government is by printing more money, taxing more, just this endless cycle, and average people can't handle this. And we see it happening all around us today. He said, your complaints will be inefficacious, worthless. This will beget public disturbances. People are going to get rowdy. He says, and I will venture to predict, without the spirit of prophecy, that you and the government, if it is adopted, will one day be at issue on this point. I think Cato in his writings, Brutus and some of the others, were much more long-term in their thinking on how things might play out, whereas some of the people on the other side were just thinking, well, this is going to be the best, and we've got the best people around, and this is going to draw the best people to run it, so of course they're going to follow things, and the people believe in liberty, and so therefore, when things go poorly, they're going to resist. And I think Cato and others were just concerned about the long-term future, and maybe we're much further off than he considered to be a problem, where it was going to start being a major problem. But a lot of what he was talking about certainly is playing out today. Now, back to Jason over at Founder of the Day. Cato then goes on to argue that the most effective way, rather than doing this tax on commerce or doing an individual tax on each person, which he thought was really, really bad, he thought the most effective and just form of taxation would be a property tax. He says, the most natural and equitable principle of apportioning taxes would be in a ratio to their property, and a reasonable impost in a ratio to their trade. But Cato, Jason writes, acknowledges that this is unlikely under the Constitution because the Senate and most of the House of Representatives will be made up of the wealthy elites who own the majority of the land. So he's saying, and we may not see it in this way today, but we often see that Congress is so willing to pass stuff that affects all of us, but it doesn't really have any impact on them. They're a special class of people where even if it does apply to them, it doesn't have the impact of disrupting their lives the way it does with us. We've seen this happen over and over and over, not just in the last few years, but for a long, long time. Now, this wasn't just some kind of anti-federalist class warfare thing. A lot of times people will talk about the agrarian anti-federalists versus the commercial urban city types that were the Federalists. Even some prominent Federalists, if my page will load here, like Governor Morris of New York in the Philadelphia Convention. He was extremely wealthy, if not one of the wealthiest of the leading founders. He actually had a very similar view. This is July 2nd, 1787. He says, history proves, I admit, that the men of large property will uniformly endeavor to establish tyranny. He thought the defense against that, rather than, he thought the defense against that was to give them their own branch, kind of an aristocracy, so they could feel they have some power. But Cato really didn't think that that was going to play out too well. He thought that the Senate was going to have so much power that it would be an aristocracy in practice. And he says, when the Senate, so important a branch of the legislature, is so far removed from the people as to have little or no connection with them, when their duration in office is such as to have the resemblance to perpetuity. How many times, even though you can vote the bums out every 6 years or so, or every couple of years in the House as well, the people with power, once they get in, we were warned by many on the anti-federalist side that even though you had the opportunity to get rid of them, that's not how it would play out in practice. And even though I'm not one of these people who say the anti-federalists were right, because I think there was some very good predictions on both sides, and there were some really garbage ones on both sides as well, this one I think really played out that way, warning over and over, not just in this particular paper, but in others, that the Senate, the way it was structured, even though you could change senators, most of them would be life members. So that's how he says it as well. Their duration in office is such as to have the resemblance to perpetuity, when they are connected with the executive by the appointment of all officers, and also to become a judiciary. He's talking about how this is the standard view if you're talking about going back to Montesquieu and others. If you combine legislative, executive, and judicial in any one person or any group of people in their hands, in one branch of power, that is the form of a tyranny. And here he is not directly quoting, but citing something that everyone at the time was pretty aware of. He's like, look, okay, they're going to be there forever. They're legislative. They're connected with the executive. And then sometimes they act as judicial. So they do have all of those powers. And I think he really landed pretty hard with that one. to become a judiciary for the trial of officers of their own appointments, he continues. Added to all this, he says, when none but men of opulence will hold a seat. We're looking at you, Lindsay. What is there left to resist and repel this host of influence and power? You're not going to. And that's, I think, a very good prediction for how things play out today. Back to Jason at Founder of the Day. He then finishes the paper with an attack on the ability and power of the Senate. Specifically, Jason writes, he distrusts their power to make treaties without even consulting the House of Representatives. The point being by Cato is anything that's going to be supreme law of the land, which includes a treaties. He's like, well, if you're going to make supreme law, shouldn't this be law made by the representatives of the people? And in the treaty power, I'm concerned, the House of Representatives has no say whatsoever. This is the executive branch, similar to the monarchy, being able to go out and make deals. But then the only consultation he gets is from this branch of government that is going to lead towards aristocracy and lead towards perpetuity. He's like, this is not really the right way to make laws. And in essence, they're going to make all kinds of nasty stuff. He says, complete acts of legislation, which are to become the supreme law of the land, ought to be the united act of all the branches of government. And that, to me, makes sense. But there is one of the most important duties may be managed by the Senate and executive alone, and to have all the force of law paramount without the aid or interference of the House of Representatives. That is the power of making treaties. And I had never really thought about that too much because we hear, of course, treaties are the supreme law of the land. Treaties can't violate the Constitution, but treaties have often done that for many years. Like the power to declare war. That can't be something that's delegated to a future, and they create some of these treaties that will drive us into war like on a press of a button. That has no say. There can be no debate then by the representatives of the people in the House, for example. And that's basically what he's warning against here. Like I said right at the outset of the show, he said by treaties, engagements may be made to raise an army, and you may be transported to Europe to fight the wars of ambitious princes. He definitely called that. We've seen it play out over and over and over the last century, and it's not just Europe, but it's other parts of the world, the Middle East, in Asia and elsewhere. And a lot of it is done by treaties or, for example, fighting in support of UN resolutions, not following the Constitution. He goes on, he says, on this account, we are in a worse situation than Great Britain. He actually says it's worse off. In many situations, the argument was, okay, the executive, for example, will be similar to the power of the monarch in Great Britain, but still much lesser. But to Cato, he thinks it's actually a worse situation. He says, with us, infallibility pervades every part of the system, and neither the executive nor his council. So the council on making treaties was not some executive council, but instead it was the Senate, the aristocracy, he said, who are a collective body, and his advisors. None of them can be brought to punishment for maladministration. Let me take a look over in the live chat and see if there's any questions or comments that I can get back to. One of these days, I am going to figure out how to actually show the chat up on the screen. I use a program called Wirecast for my live streaming because there's really good support. I might switch to another one at some point. I've had really good support on this as well. Anyways, looking over in the live chat, I want to say hi to everyone. I appreciate you spending some time with me today. I'm actually curious if you actually prefer the different intro. I thought I'd try to change it up. A lot of people complain that I talk too much at the beginning. Then you got to skip over me saying hello to people and trying to create and build a community and explain where you can find us. That is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Let me know if you actually prefer this way or if you like it when I blab a lot more right at the outset. Anyways, Dixie Strong in Alabama, Cheriton Farmer in Missouri, Tim Martin in Arizona, Vincent in Tampa. I got to ask you how to say your last name, Vincent. I'm sure I get it wrong. Quagliana? I'm sorry if I get it wrong. Clay Kent, Sharon Patriot, Liberty Gal in DFW, Phenom Anam in Tampa. Awesome. Murray Ray in Michigan, Ryan Korn also in Michigan. Run Level 1, Haji 1954. Michigan is in the house. A lot of times we have a lot of people from either Texas or Missouri, so pretty cool to see a bunch of people from Michigan as well. Run Level 1 says, some things never change. Funny how 200 plus years later, people still believe that magically the taxes will come from anywhere but the consumers. Yeah, we're just going to tax those corporations. In fact, I saw on Twitter today someone who actually I support a lot in their foreign policy goals posting about how this new billionaire tax proposal is a great idea, but it's just the right amount. What they're going to collect is the right amount for an increase in defense funding. I wonder why there's such a disconnect that when they only tax the people that they don't like, that still expands the power of the empire. That's what they use it for. They're not using it for good stuff. These are not good people in Washington, D.C. protecting and serving us. Sharon Patriot says, it's crazy that some people do not understand that the increase in taxes always gets passed on to the consumer. Yeah, this has been around, these viewpoints. I mean, Adam Smith, I believe he published 1776, and here we are a decade or so later, 11 years later. Here's Cato, Antifederalist. Cato writing about this. Thomas Jefferson talked about it. Madison, many others talked about how when you increase the taxes, this is actually a punishment on the average person. Run Level 1 also says inflation, the hidden tax. Robert Scott Bell, my great buddy who does the Robert Scott Bell Show every Monday through Friday at noon Pacific and Sunday at 10 a.m. Pacific. You should check that out as well. Sharon Patriot says, when will people stop voting for bond measures that increase taxes? I think so many people, the problem so much around us, just like H.L. Mencken once said, that the democracy is the theory that the average person, knows what they want or knows what they should get, and they get what they deserve, good and hard. Something like that. I'm paraphrasing it, but I think you get the concept. Hi to Dave Simmons. Clay Kent says, income taxes, theft or coercion or robbery, of course. M. Gabriel says, have you had your UPC tattooed yet? Of course, we're all numbered to some degree. Ed Hen says, tacos. Yo, what's up? That's pretty awesome. Scrolling through a little bit further and see if there's anything else that I can answer or any other comments. Ken Walters asked about the original 13th Amendment. That's not one I'm going to touch, but I appreciate you mentioning it. Hi to Joseph Burbo. Run Level 1 says, I prefer the blabbing, the intro and the hello. I actually like that, but I thought maybe I'd change it around once in a while and just see how things go. Joseph Burbo in Massachusetts. Vincent Quagliana says, I got it right. Ed Hen is in Long Island. And Lisa Clark in Alabama, and I appreciate everybody else. I don't know if I see any other questions that I can get to right now, but if you have any thoughts or feedback, please continue leaving it in the comments, whether it's live or in the archive. You can also email me at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Please don't forget any consideration you might give to our membership program. I would be very grateful for that. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. It starts out as little as $2 a month. And again, we make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. You can also help us spread the word, trigger algorithms, especially on the mainstream platforms, reviews on Apple Podcasts, smashing the like button on any of the mainstream platforms, whether it's Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, or any of those, Twitter, whatever. Leaving comments, subscribing, getting notifications, all that stuff will help trigger those algorithms and tell them to show us to more people. Again, I really appreciate you being here today. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you learned something. I hope it was thought-provoking. I hope you had a great weekend, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.